Welcome to section 2.1, where we're going to focus on understanding ecology. Now, ecology is going to be the bigger picture idea of biology, where we look at stuff like organisms, whole organisms, and how they interact with other organisms and their environment. So we're not going to kind of nitpick and try to go all the way down to organelles or the molecules that make up things. We're going to look at pretty much the individuals and bigger, groups of individuals. Now, there's two aspects to ecology that we're going to discuss. The first, the one that tends to be perhaps most interesting for people, is the biotic aspect. Now, when we talk about the biotic aspect, this is going to be the part that has to do specifically with living things. So this will be plants, this will be animals, this will be bacteria, where we look at how they interact with each other. The fox eats the rabbit, the rabbit eats the grass. Ultimately, they both produce waste, which gets broken down by fungus and goes back in the soil, which goes to the plant. There's all these connections between different types of life. But there's also these connections with the abiotic stuff that's out there in nature. So this is what I would oftentimes just describe as the environment. So this is going to be the temperature. This is going to be how much water is available. This is going to be the amount of sunlight. All that's going to impact who you find there, how many of them there are, how they interact with one another, whether they're competing for resources perhaps, whether they have to burrow and hide so that they don't freeze to death or get too hot. All that's going to be contributed by the non-living parts of the environment. So don't think something like sunlight's trivial. If you're a plant, it's a big deal. So how do we study this stuff? Well, the easiest way, perhaps, is just to observe. There's lots of scientists that just say, all right, I'm going to study sharks. So I'm going to try to just track them, to look at them, to study them by just seeing what they're doing. So we can figure out what's their mating ritual, where do they live, what do they like to eat. But sometimes we want to understand things more deeply. And we want to check and see if we understand things fully. So we can run experiments where we can say, I think ultimately sharks are able to detect electrical stimuli. So you might hypothesize that they can detect the little electrical impulses being given off when you contract your muscles, whether you're a fish or a shrimp or whatever else. So you could test that by putting a shark in somewhere when it's dark, for instance, with some fish. And if the shark is able to kind of hone in on those fish, then you could start to say it looks like maybe they can detect something else, such as the electrical impulses. And so these are some of the experiments that help us get a better understanding of organisms, how they behave, why they behave that way. But even that sometimes can be difficult. When we're studying ecosystems, these huge, complex areas that contain lots of different types of life, a lot of times it's just too much. And so we'll oftentimes use models. And really what a model does is it says, I want to run an experiment or I want to make observations, but there's just too much for me to go and observe, all of the elephants that happen to be on a plain in Africa. So you say, I'm going to kind of ignore a bunch of this stuff. So maybe you're going to work with something in a zoo, or maybe you're going to go to that plain in Africa, but you're going to focus on one small patch and you're only going to focus on a couple different organisms that are there. We're going to kind of ignore a lot of the other stuff because it just makes things too busy. We can't manage to detect what we need to because there's too much going on. And so models are used frequently where we just kind of trim things down and say, our model's going to look at just these two types of organisms to see how they interact. We're not going to try to do everything at once. Now, when we talk about terminology, when we say biotic factors, this is going to be things that we're going to discuss ecologically that happen to be alive. So biotic factors are going to be things like plants, or if this was aquatic, we would normally be talking about algae, which are essentially like the plant-like organisms that you find in aquatic ecosystems. I list these first because these guys tend to be the ones that harness energy from light and make it available to stuff that eats them. And so after this, we're going to have animals. They're going to eat one way or another, plants or algae. And then from there we also have fungus, which tends to break stuff down. And of course we have the ever-present bacteria we've talked about before that tend to just manage to get in just about everywhere. So biotic factors, we're looking at things that relate with these types of organisms. So biotic factors will include things like competition, where you can fight over stuff. It'll include things like predation. It'll include things like disease, where you can spread it from one to another. Anytime you're talking about a biotic to biotic interaction, two living things interacting, that's going to be a biotic factor. Now, abiotic factors, these are going to be things that could be stuff like a natural disaster. So you've got like a flood. This isn't a shark coming up and trying to eat you. That'd be biotic. But these are still going to interact the organisms. But these are still going to affect the organisms that live there because it can kill them, it can displace them, make them move. Lots of things can happen because of simple abiotic factors. If it starts to get too cold, if you have global warming and it starts to get too hot, if you get a change in things like ocean currents, you can get where the water that's coming to you might have a different temperature, it might be a different amount of salt that's in it, or different amounts of nutrients. If you tie that back to biotic factors, it could have different organisms that are coming through now because of the current. So maybe there's now new food sources or not as many food sources as there used to be. All of these factors will kind of intertwine to ultimately affect whether or not you can live somewhere and whether or not you thrive somewhere. Organism, one person. So this is going to be a singular lion in this scenario. Population is going to be a group of that type of organism, so a group of lions in the same place at the same time. So the goal here with the population is these are organisms that are capable of interbreeding. So they can have kids, they can mix their genetics. When you get to community, we're now talking about different types of organisms that are in the same place at the same time. But it's not like the lions are going to be reproducing with the zebra, most of all because it's dead right now, but they're not going to be able to successfully reproduce. They can't reproduce with millipedes and the insects that live there and the rats. And so this is going to be just a bunch of different populations that still will interact with each other because they are at the same place at the same time. But there's not normally going to be this genetic movement where they can breed together and shift around genes from one to the next. And then we're going to kind of go ecosystem here. So we've got the same thing. We've got the zebras, we've got the lions, but we're now going to consider stuff like the soil. We're going to consider stuff like the weather. These are the abiotic factors that we talked about. This is the environment that we talked about that has a big impact. And then biome, it's just a group of similar ecosystems. This happens to be a savanna, would be the type of ecosystem we'd normally refer to it as. So all the savannas we consider a biome because it's a type of ecosystem that we find. And then biosphere, a biome is essentially just going to be a group of similar ecosystems. And then the biosphere is going to be all of the earth that contains life. So essentially everything up maybe a couple miles in the air and everything down a couple miles into the ground, because there are bacteria that actually live in rocks. So if you dig down thousands of feet, you can still see bacteria that are present there. Not very many, but slowly growing. And so the biosphere is going to just kind of be like the outside part of the earth, up into the air and down probably a couple miles into the actual rock itself where life exists.